What if a simple experiment could turn ordinary people into monsters in just a few days? In 1971, inside Stanford University, a shocking study led by Philip Zimbardo revealed something terrifying about human nature. The experiment began as a serious scientific study designed to understand human behavior. Researchers carefully selected 24 college students who were physically and mentally healthy. These young men had no history of violence or crime. They were normal individuals, living ordinary lives before volunteering for what they believed was a simple psychological study. They were randomly divided into two groups, guards and prisoners. The randomness was important because it ensured that personality differences would not affect the results. Anyone could become a guard and anyone could become a prisoner. A fake prison was built inside the basement of the university. It looked real, felt real, and soon it would start to feel too real. None of the participants fully understood what they were about to experience. They believed they could handle it. But sometimes, situations can change people faster. The students assigned as prisoners were not simply asked to enter the experiment. They were arrested from their homes without warning. Real police officers participated in the process, making it feel as authentic as possible. The prisoners were handcuffed, searched, and read their rights before being transported to the makeshift prison. This experience immediately affected them. Being arrested in front of neighbors created a sense of shame and fear. Even though they knew it was part of an experiment, the emotional impact was real. Once inside, their identities were taken away. They were no longer called by their names. Instead, they were given numbers. They wore identical uniforms and were placed in small cells with limited space and comfort. Meanwhile, the guards were given uniforms, dark sunglasses, and wooden batons. They were instructed to maintain order but were not given strict guidelines. This lack of rules would soon become a serious problem. On the first day, everything seemed relatively calm. The guards tried to establish control by setting routines and giving basic instructions. The prisoners followed orders, although some felt uncomfortable with the situation. At this point, it still felt like a controlled experiment. However, tension was slowly building beneath the surface. The prisoners began to feel powerless and frustrated. They were being treated differently, spoken to harshly, and constantly reminded of their lower status. By the second day, that tension turned into action. A group of prisoners decided to rebel. They blocked their cell doors using their beds and refused to follow instructions. They shouted loudly, creating chaos inside the prison. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might take back control of their situation. But the guards saw this as a direct challenge to their authority, and they were determined to regain control. No matter what it took, the guards reacted quickly and forcefully to the rebellion. They used fire extinguishers to break open the blocked doors and regain control over the prisoners. Once they entered the cells, they began punishing the prisoners who had resisted. Some prisoners were isolated in small, dark spaces. Others were forced to perform repetitive and exhausting tasks. The punishments were not part of any official instruction. It was something the guards chose to do on their own. This marked a turning point in the experiment. The guards were no longer just maintaining order. They were beginning to assert dominance. The power they had been given started to influence their behavior in unexpected ways. The prisoners, on the other hand, began to lose confidence. Their resistance weakened as the punishments became harsher. What started as a simple role play was slowly transforming into something much more serious as the days passed. The behavior of the guards continued to change. What began as simple authority slowly turned into control and dominance. The guards started creating new rules that were not part of the original experiment. They forced prisoners to wake up in the middle of the night for roll calls, making them stand for long periods without reason. Some guards began using psychological tactics instead of physical force. They insulted prisoners, made them feel worthless, and constantly reminded them of their powerless situation. The sunglasses they wore made it easier to disconnect emotionally, allowing them to act without seeing the human reactions in the prisoners' eyes. Inside the cells, the prisoners were changing too. They became quieter, more obedient, and less willing to resist. Their sense of identity was fading. The experiment was no longer under full control. Something deeper was taking over both groups by the third day. The emotional pressure on the prisoners had become intense. Living in a confined space, constantly being watched and controlled, began to affect their mental state. Some prisoners started showing signs of anxiety and stress. One prisoner began to act out emotionally. He shouted, cried, and demanded to be released from the experiment. At first, the guards thought he was pretending, trying to escape the situation. But his reaction was real. Eventually, the researchers had no choice but to remove him from the experiment. This moment should have been a warning sign that things were going too far. However, instead of stopping, the experiment continued. The remaining prisoners saw what had happened and became even more fearful. They realized that their situation was not as temporary or controlled as they had believed. Fear replaced resistance, and silence began to spread. The guards, seeing that the prisoners were becoming more obedient, pushed even further. They introduced more strict routines and harsher punishments. Some prisoners were forced to clean toilets with their bare hands, while others were denied basic comforts like blankets. The goal was no longer just to maintain order, it had become about control. Group dynamics also began to shift. The guards started working together, encouraging each other's behavior. This made their actions even more extreme, as no one wanted to appear weak in front of the others. The prisoners, on the other hand, began to turn against each other. Some tried to follow the guards' orders perfectly, hoping for better treatment. Others became withdrawn and emotionally distant. The sense of unity among the prisoners disappeared. Everyone was trying to survive in their own way, and the experiment was becoming more intense with each passing hour. As time went on, the line between reality and role play completely disappeared. The guards no longer saw the prisoners as fellow students. To them, the prisoners were simply people they had control over. This shift in perception made their actions more extreme. They created new punishments, often without any real reason. Standing for long hours, repeating meaningless phrases, or being isolated became normal. These actions slowly broke the prisoners' mental strength. The prisoners stopped questioning the situation. Many of them accepted their roles completely, believing they had no power to change anything. Even when given opportunities to leave, some prisoners chose to stay. They had become so psychologically involved that they felt trapped, not by physical barriers, but by their own minds. The experiment had reached a dangerous level, but it was still not stopped. The researchers observing the experiment began to notice the changes, but they did not immediately intervene. They were focused on collecting data and understanding behavior, even as the situation grew more intense. This created a serious ethical problem. The guards continued their actions without restriction. Some of them became increasingly creative in their punishments, using psychological pressure to control the prisoners. Meanwhile, the prisoners' mental health continued to decline. Some experienced confusion, emotional breakdowns, and extreme stress. The environment had become toxic. What was meant to be a controlled study had turned into an uncontrolled situation where human emotions were pushed to their limits. Despite the clear signs of harm, the experiment continued. And with each passing day, the consequences became more serious. By this point, the prison environment had become fully immersive. Both guards and prisoners were deeply affected by their roles. The guards felt a sense of authority and control, while the prisoners felt powerless and trapped. Communication between the two groups was no longer normal. It was based on commands, obedience, and fear. The guards rarely showed empathy. Instead, they focused on maintaining dominance. Their behavior was influenced by the environment and the lack of accountability. The prisoners, on the other hand, showed signs of learned helplessness. They stopped trying to change their situation and simply followed orders. This psychological shift was one of the most important outcomes of the experiment. It showed how quickly human behavior can change under pressure, and how easily people can adapt to extreme conditions. As the days continued, more prisoners began to show signs of emotional distress. Some experienced panic attacks, while others became completely withdrawn. The stress of the environment was too much for them to handle. One prisoner had a severe breakdown. He lost control emotionally, shouting and crying uncontrollably. It was clear that he could not continue in the experiment. He was removed immediately. This should have been a strong signal that the experiment was causing harm. However, the researchers still did not stop the study. Instead, they replaced him with another participant. This decision showed how deeply involved the researchers had become. They were no longer just observers, they were part of the system. The experiment was no longer just about studying behavior. It had become a real-life demonstration of power and control. At this stage, the experiment had completely lost its original structure. The guards had full control over daily routines, punishments, and interactions. There were no clear limits to their authority. This lack of boundaries allowed their behavior to become more extreme. The prisoners, feeling hopeless, began to accept their situation. Some followed every rule strictly, hoping to avoid punishment. Others gave up completely, showing no reaction to anything happening around them. The environment had created two very different mindsets, one of control and one of submission. This contrast highlighted the psychological impact of power. Even though everyone knew it was an experiment, their actions and emotions were real. The situation had become a powerful example of how environment can shape human behavior, and it was becoming harder to stop. Outside the experiment, very few people knew what was happening inside the prison. It was isolated, hidden from the public, and controlled by the researchers. However, everything changed when an outsider was allowed to observe the situation. When she saw how the prisoners were being treated, she was shocked. The behavior of the guards, the emotional state of the prisoners, and the overall environment seemed disturbing and unethical. She questioned the purpose of the experiment and the decisions being made. Her reaction was different from everyone else involved. While others had become used to the situation, she saw it clearly, as something wrong. Her perspective would soon become the turning point of the entire experiment. The observer spoke directly to Philip Zimbardo and challenged him. She asked how he could allow such treatment to continue. At first, Zimbardo defended the experiment. He believed it was important for understanding human behavior, but her words made him think. For the first time, he stepped back and looked at the situation from an outside perspective. What he saw was not just an experiment. It was a system where people were being harmed. This realization was difficult, but necessary. It showed how even researchers can become influenced by the environment they create, and how important it is to question actions, even in the name of science. After reflecting on the situation, Zimbardo made a critical decision. He chose to end the experiment earlier than planned. Originally, it was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it was stopped after just 6 days. This decision came after recognizing the psychological harm being caused to the participants. The guards had become too aggressive. The prisoners had become too distressed. Continuing the experiment would have caused even more damage. Ending it was the only responsible choice. This moment marked the conclusion of one of the most controversial experiments in history. But the effects of what happened did not end there. They continued long after the experiment was over. After the experiment ended, the participants were carefully observed and evaluated. Many of them reported strong emotional reactions to what they had experienced. Some guards were surprised by their own behavior. They did not expect to act in such a controlling or harsh way. The prisoners, on the other hand, spoke about feelings of fear, helplessness, and stress. These reactions showed how powerful the situation had been. Even though it was a short experiment, its impact was long-lasting. The participants had learned something important about themselves, and the researchers had learned something even more important about human behavior. The experiment raised serious questions about ethics in psychological research, and those questions are still discussed today. The results of the experiment were widely studied and discussed. It became one of the most famous psychological studies in history. It showed how quickly people can adapt to roles and environments. It also showed how dangerous power can be when it is not controlled. The experiment influenced many areas of research, including psychology, sociology, and ethics. It changed how future experiments were designed. Strict ethical guidelines were introduced to protect participants. This was one of the most important outcomes of the study. It ensured that similar situations would not happen again, at least not in the same way. The results of the experiment were widely studied and discussed. It became one of the most famous psychological studies in history. It showed how quickly people can adapt to roles and environments. It also showed how dangerous power can be when it is not controlled. The experiment influenced many areas of research, including psychology, sociology, and ethics. It changed how future experiments were designed. Strict ethical guidelines were introduced to protect participants. This was one of the most important outcomes of the study. It ensured that similar situations would not happen again, at least not in the same way. The results of the experiment were widely studied and discussed. It became one of the most famous psychological studies in history. It showed how quickly people can adapt to roles and environments. It also showed how dangerous power can be when it is not controlled. The experiment influenced many areas of research, including psychology, sociology, and ethics. It changed how future experiments were designed. Strict ethical guidelines were introduced to protect participants. This was one of the most important outcomes of the study. It ensured that similar situations would not happen again, at least not in the same way. The Stanford Prison Experiment remains one of the most important and controversial studies ever conducted. It revealed something uncomfortable but necessary about human behavior. It showed that under the right conditions, anyone can change. The experiment was not just about guards and prisoners. It was about power, control, and the human mind. Even today, it serves as a warning, a reminder that situations can shape actions, and that awareness is the first step to preventing harm. The story may have ended in 1971, but its message is still relevant, because the real question is not what happened back then, it's what could happen again. Subscribe our channel, SJN History, for next video.